right, Exodus 19, let's get to work. We are in a series called The God of, and the title of my message this morning is The Promise of Power. And my hope for you as we gather here in this place today is that you would experience in your life and receive the invitation of your life to live in the power that is available to you from Jesus himself. When I first began to follow Jesus on my own, it was not my parents' faith anymore, it was my faith. I realized very quickly that I could not do what God had called me to do, nor could I become who Jesus wanted me to become in my own strength. I needed a power outside of me, and not just a superficial power or a momentary power. I needed a eternal and supernatural power, which God offers to you today. He offers us a power, and he promises this power that you could live in it and become who he has called you to be. And I want to show you how this power is visible and seen in this particular covenant. Now, you may not know what the covenants are, and that's okay. If you are a new follower of Jesus, if you are a seasoned follower of Jesus, if you have walked into this room or you're watching online and you have never heard of Jesus, it is important for you to know and understand the covenants of God. If you are a parent in the house, it is important for you to teach your children the covenants of God. These are the promises of God, and there are 5 central covenants in the scriptures, and here they are, 5 of them: the Noahic, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, the Davidic, and then what's known as the New Covenant. 4 out of the 5 are in the Old Testament. Testament simply means covenant. It's in the Old Covenant. 1 is in the New Covenant. The word covenant simply means promise. Now, these 5 promises give us the pathway of God's redemptive work in history. In other words, it's showing us the journey of how God is moving and meeting his people and rescuing his people from darkness and into light, and how he is bringing the kingdom into this reality, and we are invited into this kingdom, and the covenants show us this pathway. The other thing the covenants do is that they reveal to us who God is. And so if you're a new follower of Jesus, you're a seasoned follower of Jesus, you've never heard of Jesus, if you are going to follow Jesus or you want to know about him, it's important to know who he is and what he's done. How does he work? If you don't know who God is, if you don't know who someone is, you probably shouldn't follow them. So God wants you to know who he is, the nature of how he operates and his movement in the world, and then invite you into that promise. So I want to unpack for you today the Mosaic Covenant. So go to Exodus 19, go to verse 5. We'll get there in just 1 second. Now, what you'll see today in our time is there's 3 things happening in this Mosaic Covenant. What you'll see is a covenant from God that is committed, or let's say a commitment is proposed, a commitment is accepted. You'll see this beautiful foreshadowing, and then you'll see the visible sign of that particular covenant. Now, Exodus 19, the Mosaic Covenant is a little bit different in that the covenant is actually not just found in 2 verses or 3 verses. The covenant that God is making to the people of Israel through Moses actually occurs from Exodus 19 through 24. It is here in these chapters that God establishes himself as the God of Israel. So God is saying, I will be your God and you will be my people. And it's unpacked over these chapters. However, it's all sort of built around Exodus 19, 5, and 6. And here's what I want to show you. This is important for us to realize. The covenants of God reveal God's plan to ordain blessing over his chosen people. The movement of God is always moving his people into blessing. And this is important for you and I to realize, because more often than not, we feel cursed, or we feel as though we're invited into a relationship with a set of rules that we always have to abide by. But the promise of God is to actually invite you into a blessing. The scriptures begin with God blessing humanity. He says to the first humans, Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. This is the first blessing. Jesus, when he enters the scene and begins preaching in Matthew 5, he begins preaching a sermon of blessing. Blessed are the poor in spirit. spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons and daughters of God. God is always moving towards you and ordaining you in blessing. That word ordain means he is setting you apart in blessing. That the blessing that God has for his people is different than the kind of blessing the world talks about. It is a holy and blameless and righteous and joyful blessing that God is inviting you into. And we see this moving and happening in this Mosaic Covenant, Exodus 19, verse 5 and 6. Here's what is written in the text, Exodus 19. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. Now, what do we see in this covenant? Three things I want to show you. First and foremost is this. What do we see in this Mosaic covenant? We see God's divine commitment to his word. When I was in college and in high school, there was this thing that you would do if you were interested in someone or you were dating someone. You would call them and leave them the lyrics or to a song that you really loved. And remember these days? No, I'm not the only one that you remember. You would leave the lyrics to a song. You wouldn't say anything because the song said everything. It was everything you needed to say. And so I was sort of interested in this girl, and so she left me this voicemail, this message, and it was a little song that goes a little bit something like this. I don't care. No, it wasn't that one. That was what I sent to her. What she sent to me was, I swear by the moon and the stars in the sky, I'll be there. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's giving me her word. She'll be here. 2 days later, she broke up with me. So basically, what she swore, she lied. Now, I ended up making out in real life because I got a much better person in my wife, but she lied. She lied. God is faithful to his word. Most every problem in your life, most every frustration in your life, when it comes to any type of relationship, whether it's with leaders, whether it's with the church, whether it's with the place you work, whether it's in a relationship you are in, the frustration usually lies in the fact that the person can't keep their word. Which is why Jesus says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything else comes from a wicked heart. So most of the time, we make commitments we don't keep. Commitments are made to us that are never kept. And we feel the pain of this. We feel the pain of the lack of commitment because people these days don't live by their word. I have 4 sons. I'm trying to teach my 4 sons. The fourth one, I'm not teaching very much. At this point, he's 3 months. We're just trying to keep him alive. That's all we're trying to do with him. But the other 3, I'm trying to teach them to be men of the word and men of their word. So this plays out all the time in real life. There we are last week hanging out at the local Walmart. Now, Walmart in Inglewood's pretty sketchy to begin with, but there we are in Walmart. And lo and behold, my 7-year-old turns the corner and there's a gummy worm hanging out of his mouth. Now, I have not bought any gummy worms, nor have we brought any gummy worms. So I say, hey, Eli, where did you get that gummy worm? And as he's chewing, he says, I just found it on the counter. It's like, well, Eli, a couple things happening here. Number one, who knows where that has been? Don't do that. Secondly, if you haven't bought it and it wasn't given to you and you take it, what is that called? And as he's chewing, he goes, stealing. And are you a thief? No. So and I'm starting to get a little fired up here. I'm starting to get a little fired up with my kids. So I'm like, Eli, spit that out of your mouth. And so hits the ground. I'm like, Eli, listen to me. I don't care what happens in your life. One day, when you have stupid friends and they try to convince you to take something that's not yours, you tell them that you're not a thief. And then my 5-year-old goes, hey, his friends aren't stupid. I'm his friend. Like, not his friends now, his friends in the future. Not now, his future friends. So Eli, give me your word that you will not take anything. He's like, Dad, I give you my word. And he's looking like, don't touch it. It's now on the ground. Your spit's all over it. Don't do this. I want them to be men of their word. Because we live in a culture where people look for charisma over character. We look for influence over integrity. And that's virtually every problem we have today in society, in our leadership, even in the church. We look for people who have great stage charisma and no character behind the scenes. And some of you are in relationships right now that you know you should not be in because you know homeboy has no character. But man, he's charismatic. Gosh, she's influential. But you know she has no integrity. God is not like us. God is faithful to his word. Faithfulness is not something God does. Faithfulness is who he is. 8,810 promises are found in the scriptures. 8,810 promises found in the scriptures. And there's over 116 verses that remind us of God's faithfulness. Psalm 33, verse 4, the word of the Lord is upright, and all his works he is faithful. God is faithful to his commitment. And what is the commitment that God is making in this place? What God is actually doing is not making a new commitment. He's going back and reaffirming a previous commitment. He's going all the way back to the promise he made in Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12, where God promises Abraham land, nationhood, and blessing. Now, how do we know that God is doing this? If you look in verse 3 of Exodus 19, God says to Moses, go and tell the house of Jacob. Now, who is the house of Jacob? Abraham had a son. His name was Isaac. Isaac had a son. His name was Jacob. There was a song we used to sing in Sunday school growing up in church. If you don't know this, I'm going to teach you right now. It goes a little bit something like this. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Right hand, right foot, left foot. Turn. It was a long time ago. I remember all of it. So when God says, say to the house of Jacob, he is essentially saying, Israel, you are the house of Jacob, and I have not forgotten you or my promise for land, nationhood, and blessing. I am still moving, and I am still blessing you. And what God does in this moment is he recommits to a proposal. He proposes something to them. There's a key word in verse 5 and 6, and God is saying, if you will. If you will, then I shall. God proposes something to them. And what does this tell us about God? What is God doing in this moment? This reveals to us God's divine invitation into blessing. That God desires to bless his children and bless his people. How do we know that God is doing this? It says there that God says, if you do this, then I shall. That word shall is become. You shall become my what? My treasured possession. You have anything in your life that it's your treasured possession? It's the thing that you hold most dearest to. When my wife and I first got married, we had this bottle of champagne that I was saving. It was my treasured possession. And I was saving it for the perfect moment. Our first year anniversary came up. That wasn't it. Our first son was born, was not feeling it. Our second son was born, just wasn't there yet. Our third son was born, wasn't quite feeling it. The Cubs won the World Series. It was time to take that champagne bottle out. And I doused myself in it, and I danced it was idolatry at its finest. I have repented, the Lord has forgiven me, but it was my treasured possession. The other treasured possession I have is Hannah's bouquet from our wedding. Now, she wants to always throw this away, but I love it. I love looking at this thing because it's age. It's not new and fresh anymore. It's age, and I want our marriage to grow in age, to be beautiful in a season of life together. It's a treasured possession for me. God is saying to his people, you will be my treasured possession. You I will make into a kingdom of priests. You I will call as a holy nation. God is saying, I'm going to set you apart from the rest of this world. This is why Jesus says to us that we must be in the world, but not of the world. I will set you apart from the world, and I will provide for you. I will protect you. I will nurture you. Essentially, God is saying to his people in this covenant, I will give you a new identity. Now, why does this matter for Israel? Because their entire life, their only identity was that of slaves. That's all they knew. They were slaves in Egypt. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't worship. They couldn't eat. They couldn't raise their kids. They couldn't work. They couldn't do anything unless Pharaoh said they could. They were slaves in every way. That was their central identity. One of my favorite movies is The Shawshank Redemption. And in this particular scene, Red, who has been in prison for over 40 years, is finally released, and he's working at a grocery store. And he puts his hand up and he says, "Boss, can I go to the restroom?" And his boss calls him over and says, "You don't have to ask me to go to the restroom. You can just go." And it shows this scene of Red coming out of the restroom, and he says in this monologue, "For 44 years, I couldn't go to the bathroom without ever asking permission. Not a single drop." That's all he ever knew. Apart from Jesus, all we ever know, all Israel knew, was their slavery. And God is saying, I am bringing you into a new identity. And then over chapters 19 through 24, God begins to unpack and give them the promises and the covenants and the commands to live by. He gives them the 10 commandments. And we often look at the 10 commandments as, oh, these must be the 10 rules I have to follow. But these are 10 things that God gives them a new identity. He says, you shall worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Because they couldn't worship anyone unless Pharaoh said they could. God is saying, you shall not murder, because they've never known an existence where someone couldn't be murdered. Now you could actually live life and love life and see the image of God in everyone. You didn't have to worry about being murdered. Or he says, remember the Sabbath. Remember to rest, because all they ever knew was work, 24 hours, no respite at all. And God is saying, I'm giving you a new identity. You can rest. And he gives them laws to live by for justice and worship and work. All of this was to form their identity, but all of this was to invite them as a people of blessing, to live as a blessed people. Friends, this is the invitation of Jesus. This is the redemptive work of Jesus to bless you, to release you into blessing. But the problem we have today is we have cheapened what blessing means. It's more just a cultural phrase. God, you gotta bless this mess. I'm too blessed. I'm too blessed to stress. That's the one. Or if you have anyone related to you from the South, they always look at you and they say, bless your heart. My wife's grandma would say that to me all the time. Bless your heart. I thought she was being nice. Bless my heart. I didn't realize the translation of that particular phrase. See, the older you get, you start to realize there's translation for what people are saying. There's a couple I've just noticed as I get older, especially in family and marriage. I've noticed that when Hannah or any wife says, I've been thinking about it, translation, it's already been decided. I've noticed when Hannah or any wife hands you a list and says, when you get around to it, it means do it now. Do it now. Can you imagine what would happen if I handed my wife a list and it said, do it now? I mean, she can't deport me, but I would definitely be digging my own grave. It'd be on my list, dig your own grave so you could be buried. The translation of bless your heart is what? Like, you're stupid. That's what the translation is. You're an idiot. That's what that means. And so we've cheapened the idea of blessing. What does it mean to be blessed? Blessed, friends, is the simple idea that God moves towards you. It's as Bonhoeffer would say, the visible, perceptible proximity of God. Don't you love that? To know that no matter where you go or where you've been, what you've gone through, that God is moving towards you. As the psalmist says, the nearness of our God is our good. He moves towards us, but the world would have us believing that blessing is more superficial. It's more about how to live a comfortable life. Money and good cost of living and the bigger home and the nicer car and the great job and the great marriage and the great friends, and you get to do the things you're passionate about. That's God blessing you. Let me talk to the students right here, because this is gonna happen to you. I'm gonna talk to you students because they don't like to listen to this kind of stuff. So I'm gonna just talk to you guys. There is a world out there. There are good-meaning Christians out there that will try to convince you that God blessing you is to have a good life and a good job and good money and good kids in a good neighborhood with good friends and good health and good wealth. If that is the definition of blessing, then Jesus was the most cursed human who ever lived, because he was poor and he died alone with his friends betraying him. But if the blessing of God is to know that in any situation or circumstance, you can live anchored in the unwavering and unshakable joy of God, then you are eternally blessed. To know that no matter what your situation might be, the blessing of your life is not to live in superficial comfort, but in the supernatural presence of God, then you can live as a blessed person. John Wesley, the great Methodist preacher, described a blessed person this way. He said, "The one who is blessed is the one who stands, and the opening heavens around him shine with beams of sacred bliss." That is what it means to be blessed. And this is what God offers. God offers blessing, but as C.S. Lewis would say, that we are too busy playing with mud pies when a holiday at the sea is available. God offers blessing, but the word that's most important is the word if. If. There's two types of covenants that God makes. There's one covenant that's known as the royal grant covenant. This would be the covenant that God makes to Noah. Never again will I flood this earth. No matter what we do, how we live, how we act, God says, I will do this. It does not matter what you do. It's a royal grant. The other type of covenant is known as a suzerain vassal. It's a conditional covenant. If you, then I will. I will absolutely deliver if you will hold your part. Now, what's fascinating about this, God proposes this commitment, and the Israelites accept. If you fast forward to verse 7 and 8, God commands Moses to speak to the people and tell them about this covenant and what's to come. So Moses says, God is asking us to covenant to him. God is asking us to commit to him. And the people say, all that God has asked us to do, we will obey. Now, what's fascinating about this is they don't know what God has asked them to do. They just commit. They don't know yet what God has asked them to do. Now, isn't that fascinating? If God came to you and said, if you will, then I will, but you have to commit first. Every one of us is asking, well, what am I committing to? What exactly am I committing to? I have the type of personality where I don't like spontaneity. Any just high-strung, type A, need Jesus people out there, just like me. Like, I can be spontaneous if you tell me the hours in which we are planning for our spontaneity. But I need to know. When people say like, hey, can I get a meeting with you? I need to talk about something. What are we talking about? I want to know what we're talking about so I can be prepared for the conversation. I don't want to just get into a surprise meeting. So every one of us is asking, well, God, lay out the commitment. Tell me what it is. Because I know your word says thy word is a lamp unto my feet, but I need a floodlight to show me the whole picture. I know you only like to give puzzle pieces. I need to see the whole thing before I can commit to this. But they commit. Why do they commit to this? There was a trust and a gratitude of what they had seen the Lord already doing in their lives. Theologian William Dumbrell, in speaking about this particular text and this exchange, says this about this moment. He says, the acceptance sprang from the depths of a grateful heart in whose experience the blessings of redemption were vitally important. In other words, because they had seen what God had done in the past, they trusted him for the future. Because they were grateful for the rescue in the past, they trusted in the provision for the future. How could they trust God? What had they seen in God to trust him? What attribute What was the nature of God that they saw that allowed them to trust God? What is the nature of God that you need to see in your life, that I need to see in my life, that tells me that God can be trusted? And the answer to that is God's power. See, what this text reveals to us is God's divine power to deliver on his promise. The Jewish people would never speak the word Yahweh. And in fact, the name Yahweh is first given to Moses. But they would never say that name. And when they were talking about God, they would often bow their heads and they would lift up their pinky. And by lifting up their pinky, it was them speaking to Yahweh. And they believed that God in his pinky had more power than all of humanity combined. And they would lift up and they would sing to Yahweh and they would pray to Yahweh, believing in his power. What had they seen? Where had they seen God's power? The answer is in verse 4. In verse 4, right before the covenant, we see this. You yourselves, this is God speaking to the people of Israel, to the house of Jacob. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians. What did God do to the Egyptians? In Exodus chapter 1, we see Israel growing greatly. Their population is gaining power. And Pharaoh, the leader of Egypt, or Pharaoh, as some people like to call him, sees this, and in response to this great power arising in Israel, he begins to place them under subjectivity and makes them slaves in his house. In Exodus 3, God, in a place called Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, brings Moses up to the mountain and in a burning bush reveals to Moses who he is and says, Moses, I want you to go to Pharaoh's house, to the palace, and tell him to let my people go. So Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, let my people go, which brings us to another great Sunday school song. Some of you know this one, don't you? You knew it was coming. You were waiting for it the moment I said Moses, you were waiting for the song, when Israel was in Egypt land. Seriously, none of you know this song? What's the next line? Anyone here go to Awana? If you're homeschooled, put your hand up. You definitely know this song. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand. Go down, Moses, way down. Let my people go. Oh man, we used to have robes and everything. It was great. We used to do the whole thing. Flanograms, all of it. So Moses goes, and he says, let my people go into the wilderness that they might worship. Pharaoh's heart is now hardened by God himself. Not only does Pharaoh say no, he makes the oppression even harder. He makes the oppression harder. So this time Moses goes back, once again says, let my people go. And with God's hand and God's power, 10 plagues go over Egypt. The Nile turns into blood. Locusts start appearing. At the very end, the very last plague, the angel of death goes over the entire nation, and every firstborn child is taken, except for those who have painted on their doorposts the blood of a lamb. And after all of this, Pharaoh finally relents and he lets the people go. And as they are going in the wilderness, they quickly realize that the Egyptians have changed their mind. They're coming after them. But God opens the Red Sea. Israel goes through it. And as Egypt is chasing them, God in his power, who has power over all of nature and creation, closes the sea and destroys their enemy. God is saying, you have witnessed yourself the power of my hand. And then he goes on to say, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. God is saying, in the wilderness, you saw how I fed you, how I gave you water, how I protected you in battle. And now I have brought you all the way to Mount Sinai, the very place of my presence. I have done all of this for you. This, friends, is the great display of God's power. They trusted in his past deliverance, so they trust in the power for the future. Now, all of God's promises, all of his faithfulness to the people of Israel, to you and I, it hinges on one particular thing. It hinges on, is God powerful enough to deliver on what he declares? Can God actually do this? My entire childhood was framed by my parents in the reality that God is all powerful and God can do anything. And it would drive me nuts at times because by nature, I hustle and I plan and I grind it out and I figure out a way. And my parents' plan is very simple. They trust and they pray. And I remember we would get into these arguments and contentions like, no, Dad, you have to do something. And no, you have to move out. You have to make it happen. And they would say, no, you have to trust and pray. And time again, I have seen in my life and witnessed what God has done in our family, in our world, because God can be trusted with his power. He is an all-powerful being. He is an all-powerful God. This church is the testament of God's power. The people who gather, yes, we are grateful for the people who give and serve and lead and love generously, but make no mistake about it, this church exists because God's hand is on it. And you could do everything right, and if God's hand is not on it, nothing happens. You could do everything wrong, and if God's hand is on it, it'll happen. Everything in your life hinges on God's power to deliver on what he has declared. Now, herein lies the tension because, friends, there is a big difference between a commitment and a capacity. We make commitments, and we realize very quickly we don't have the capacity to fulfill said commitments. Most every pain in your life, let's be real for a moment, most every frustration in your life is the result of a commitment made without the capacity to come through on it. It's why many of us live in the reality of broken homes and divided homes and divorces. Because a commitment made on that day didn't have the capacity to sustain in hard times. And many of you are living in the reality of that. Many of you are living in the tension of the commitment to dreams and career and relationship and belonging and friendship and broken families exist because the capacity to come through on those wasn't there. We don't have a commitment issue. We have a capacity issue. We don't have the capacity to come through on what has been committed. And virtually all the pain in our life is the result of that. And the greater, deeper tension then is, how do I trust God? Can I trust God who's made a commitment? See, most of us in our most angry moments with God, in our most doubtful moments with God, in our most frustrating moments with God, is not that we question God's commitment. Deep down, we know that God is good. We know that God is full of grace. We know that God is seeking after our highest good. We believe this. We know this. What we fail to hold on to is, does God have the capacity to actually deliver on that? That's where your frustration lies. And so you're sitting in a room like this, you're watching online, you're asking yourself, yes, God made a commitment to his word that I won't be lonely anymore, but I'm starting to wonder if God even has the capacity to change hearts. Yes, God made a commitment to us that if we plant the seeds of faith in our children, when they are older, those seeds will come to fruition. But I'm starting to doubt if God has the capacity, if God's stronger than this prevailing culture, because I can't seem to see God working anymore. Some of us are in this place and like, my body is weak and it's frail and it's dying and I'm exhausted from every 6 months going to have to check if the cancer is back. And God made a commitment to me that he would be there for me, that no weapon formed against me can prosper. But I'm starting to doubt if God has the capacity over sickness. We don't trust if God has capacity. And God is showing us that the nature of his character is that he is omnipotent. That is his attribute. It means he is all powerful. What does it mean that God is omnipotent? It simply means that God can never be less than who he is. He cannot be less than who he is. And it means that within himself, no outside source, within himself, God is an all-sufficient God. He is a self-sustaining God. He needs no external source or power. Everything else in your life needs external power. God needs no external power. He is full of omnipotence, which means that God is infinitely capable of all that he says he can do. The power is within himself. This is why wherever Jesus walked, people were astonished by his power. He had the power to open the scroll and teach as a man with authority. He had the power to touch and heal those who were sick. In one instance where a woman is walking and she fights through the crowd to meet Jesus, all she wants to do is touch the fringe of his garment. And when she touches the fringe of his garment, Jesus says, I have sensed that power has been released from me. Now, how many of you would just love to touch the fringe of his garment? To sense that power has been released from him. Jesus has resurrection power, where he stands in front of a tomb and he says, Lazarus, come out. He was a man full of power. And they trusted in this power. And God is asking you if you are willing to trust in the capacity of his power and the commitment to deliver on what God has declared. Friends, the good news of the gospel is that God has delivered on what he has declared because only he has the power to do so. And he invites us into this life. And many of you are sitting in this room, and as I'm saying this, you're thinking to yourself, that's probably true for them, but it's not true for me. It's not true for my marriage. It's not true for my parents. It's not true for my city. It's not true for the violence I see. It's not true for the hearts that I see. It's not true for my life. Maybe it's true for them, but it's not true for me. And God is saying to you, friends, that there is a power available to you, available for you, available in you. So don't miss this. There is a beautiful foreshadowing happening here. Because what do we do with this covenant? What do we do with this that happened thousands of years ago? There's a foreshadowing happening. Even though Israel agreed, they couldn't keep their end of the bargain. They couldn't keep their end of the bargain. They kept failing over and over and over again. They kept complaining over and over and over again. They would get to the point in the wilderness where Israel is saying, it was better when we were slaves. Take us back to when we were slaves. At least we knew that we would eat and we would drink. Yeah, they treated us as slaves, but you know what? We'd rather go back to that. You know why, friends? It's always easier to go back into a life of slavery than to walk in the uncertainty of God's calling for your life. Always willing to go back to their slavery. So Israel fails, just like we fail, but God never fails. And the foreshadowing is God saying one day there will be an ultimate deliverance, and there will be an ultimate all-powerful deliverer. And he won't be Moses. No, he'll be the greater Moses. Jesus was the very embodiment of power. Hebrews 1:3 about Jesus says he was the radiance of the image of God, the exact imprint of his nature. And by his word, he upholds all things in his power. And Jesus has the power to graft you and I, people far from God, into the house of Jacob. We are, by the blood of Jesus on the cross, for all those who confess and believe that Jesus is Lord, now have been grafted in, and we have become God's treasured possession. We have become a kingdom of priests. We have become a holy nation. God is setting us apart. Friends, this says more about God than it says about us. That God is willing to open his invitation to all people if they would want to live in his blessing and receive the invitation into that blessing. God opens that to you and I. That we were now his treasured possession. So what do we do with this? What do we do with this? How do we live in this power? The power of Jesus that's available to you is available in you. Don't miss this. See, every week, all I'm trying to do every week when I open this text to you, if you ever want to know, if you look at the top sheet, I have one sheet that I study, and the top line just says, paint a picture of life with God. That's all I'm trying to do every week, is show you life with God. And the reason this is so important to understand the power of God available to you is because more often than not, my day-to-day conversations with Christians, with followers of Jesus, is how offended they are by the world. How they can't forgive someone who's done something to them. How they're so triggered by every single thing that's happening. Every conversation is about anxiety and depression and loneliness. Every conversation I seemingly have is about how we have embraced an identity of being victims. And listen, I'm not in any way, stretch or form, aiming to minimize your pain. I'm trying to help you maximize the power of God in your life. not that you would deny your past, but you would stop letting it define your future. Don't miss this. The covenant-giving God and the covenant-fulfilling God is the power-filling God. Jesus says to his disciples, but wait until you have received power from on high. And friends, the same power that caused Jesus to rise from the grave is the same power that has rescued you and I from a life of slavery. And I know you're saying, I've never been a slave before. People said that to Jesus. The Pharisees and the Sadducees, they told Jesus, we've never been slaves to anyone. Jesus says, really? Looks like you've been slaves to everyone. The Egyptians, the Babylonians, you name it. The Romans right now are persecuting you. And that's how we look. I'm not a slave to anyone, really. Are you a slave at all? The way I see it and the way I see it in my own life is that maybe we're slaves to our money. Maybe we're slaves to our standard of living. Maybe we're slaves to this great country we live in. Maybe we're slaves to our family. Maybe we're slaves to our parents' expectations. Maybe we're slaves to our ideologies. What you're seeing today in the news with everything happening is a people who are enslaved to their worldview and enslaved to they're enslaved to the thoughts in their own mind. They have no functional ability to take every thought captive. They're slaves to their sexuality, slaves to their dreams, slaves to their ambition, slaves to their friendships. We are slaves, and God in his power rescues us from a life of slavery. It's the power of God to forgive us and the power of God to move in us to forgive others. How many of you right here, right now, don't tell me in a room this size that virtually all of us are wrestling with unforgiveness in our heart, wrestling with the failed expectations of someone else and the anger and bitterness we have towards them. That's why when they walk in a room, you can't even look at them. You got to walk out. You could not imagine being in the same place as them. And when you are around them, you just act a little civil. The bitterness in our hearts, God frees us from in his power. This is why the great hymn writer, Charles Wesley, he says, he breaks the power of canceled sin. He sets the prisoner free. Jesus on the cross, he rescues you from the penalty of sin, but he also, in his life, death, burial, and resurrection, he defeats the power of sin over you, that it no longer has any power. This is the freedom that God offers you. Friends, the same power that conquered the grave is the same power that is alive and well in you. And the great tragedy of our day is we have followers of Jesus who would rather live self-sufficient lives than in the all-sufficient power of Jesus. And Paul knows this, which is why throughout his letters to the New Testament, he writes about this. He says, church, you have a power that's available. So he says to the Corinthian church, he says, I would rather boast in my weakness. How many of you here want to boast in your weakness? I want to boast in my weakness so that the power of God might rest on me, so that in my weakness I am strong. He says to the church in Philippi, we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Now that doesn't mean I would go to my gym and there would be like, I can do all things. I can't bench 300. That's not what that text was for. What Paul is saying is that everything God has called you to do and everything he has called you to become will be accomplished by his power. And we live in this strange thought that we somehow believe that God has rescued us by his power only to finish us in ours. And God says, do you think I would call you and save you by the Spirit only to let you be completed in the flesh? So we believe God has led me to this Spirit-filled marriage, but now I got to do it on my own strength. God has led me to this school to be a student. The Spirit has left me there, but now I got to do it in my own power. God has brought me to this situation, this reality with these children, but I got to parent in my own power. And we tell ourselves these things and we convince ourselves that God's power is not available. And the great tragedy of life, friends, is that God's power is available. He won't force it on you. He just invites you to experience it, which is what Paul says to the church in Ephesus. Now unto him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we can ask or think. Listen, I have a wild imagination, and Paul is saying God can do infinitely more than you can ask or imagine according to his power that is at work in us. To him, to Christ be the glory in the church and throughout all generations forever and forever and forever. Friends, I'm telling you, there is a power available for you. You have to receive that power. This is the covenant God makes. I will be your God, you will be my people. My power has become your power. And I'll end with this. What's the sign of this covenant? How do we know this is real? The sign. The sign for Noah was the rainbow. The sign for Abraham was circumcision. What's the sign of this covenant? That God will be our God and we will be his people. Go back to Exodus 3. We'll end with this. In Exodus 3, on Mount Horeb, God calls Moses, and he says this to Moses: I will send you to Pharaoh. Verse 12, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. Here's the sign. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. Here's the sign that the people of God would come around Mount Horeb and worship. But you notice the problem, don't you? Because in Exodus 19, they're not at Mount Horeb, they're at Mount Sinai. In Exodus 24, once the covenant has been made, Moses actually builds an altar and the people come to worship. But herein lies the problem. They're at Mount Sinai. Didn't God say the sign would be Mount Horeb? Well, when we studied the scriptures, we realized that Mount Horeb and Mount Sinai are the same place. It's called the Mount of God, which tells us this, friends, the sign that God is our God and we are his people is worship. Gathered to worship. This is why this matters. And I wish Christians in the West would realize this and hold on to this with the urgency of Christians in the East. That as long as people are gathered to worship, it is as Egyptian theologian Safwat Marzouk would say, a worshiping people is God's sign that he is still active in the world. So every neighborhood, every village, every city, as long as there are people who are gathered to worship, it means that God's power is still in this city, that God is still sovereign, that God will still have his way in our lives and in our families. And I wish that Christians in the West would realize that this isn't just an activity or a hobby. This is God's sign. Why do we worship? Because we love God. That's why we worship. Why do we worship? Because we're formed as his people, but we worship because it's the sign that God is still here. That's why we worship. This is God's promise for you, friends. Tell me that you don't need power. Tell me that you don't need to come to him in true and contrite worship.